Hi there. Um, I'm very glad to get back to you for a last session um, about your modern poetry course this semester. So that we are left now with a bunch of very singular, very original poets called the Imagists. And as I'm talking to you now, I'm looking at the selection of poems. I think 7 of them that figure at the end of the booklet you have with you. And I think that I'm going to get out one of the poets. I think it's Marianne Moore with Ennui and a Jellyfish that we are going to really dismiss from this last session. And we are left with 3 poets in all and 5 poems. Well, 2 by Ezra Pound, very, very short poems, but in fact very enjoyable when you have been introduced in how to read them. So the 2 poems by Ezra Pound are In a Station of the Metro and the Days by Hilda Doolittle. We have Ariad and another poem a little longer called Helen of Troy, of course. And the last poem in the session is one that I already mentioned several times in class, The Red Wheelbarrow by Carlos Williams. Great. So in fact, I think that the images or imagisme with a final E, with a final E at the end, needs a little introduction before we get to the poets themselves and to their poems. And I'm going here to, in fact, make a very brief and simplified overview of the history of this movement since its emergence in England around 1910, from 1908-1910 until 1928. I think the last anthology of the Imagist poets was posthumously published in 1930, but that's when some of the Imagist poems, namely Amy Lowell, were dead. But the period between 1910 and 1925 is about 10-15 years. That's very short-lived. That's really short-lived, and this is the first point that I wanted to make about imagism in poetry, that it was a short-lived movement. It did not endure in time, but it was a very powerful movement. It also was contemporary to other movements in the arts that held several labels. We had the Georgians, we had the Vorticists, we had the Futurists, and the Imagists. In fact, cohabited or were contemporary in time to these movements. We are going to concentrate on Imagism as perhaps the most powerful of these several movements that, in fact, contributed considerably to enhancing modern poetry, to creating a modern poetry, and especially a modernist poetry. And in this last session, I shall, in fact, make the relation between the vision and the set of practices that les imagistes use in their poetry, and the contribution of some to the theory and also to the practice of this repertoire of poetry, but also, in fact, study some poems or read them with you, so that you have an idea about how, in fact, the images applied their vision of the arts, their vision of poetry, in the poems. They by and large, the images had a very interesting agenda that recalls some of the precepts of Romanticism. For instance, writing in a language that is commonplace, or making poetry accessible to a large, not elitist audience. So in this regard, they sometimes remind us of the Romantics, even if their philosophical vision of art certainly dismisses and refuses the legacy of the Romantics. They also, in their use of imagery, to me, they sound like the French symbolists, and they were greatly inspired by the French symbolist poets. But contrarily to these symbolists, to the French symbolists, they had their own particular use of the image. So in fact, and my introduction is going to be about these things. Okay, so to start with, let me just put this poetic trend into context. So around 1910, about that time, a number of American poets, in fact, came to the continent, and especially to London. Ezra Pound arrived about that time. Hilda Doolittle also joined him in London. T.A. Hulme, one of the main theorists of this trend or movement, returned to Brussels and then to London from Canada, and began in 1907 to form the first theoretical statements on poetry, and around along with other poets. They all of them created a literary circle in London. They called the Poets Club. F.S. Flint and D.H. Lawrence, although Lawrence to a much lesser degree, used in due course. So in fact, about this time, that is around 1910 to 1914, a number of American poets emigrated. Some of them just came on holidays and they stayed in Europe for all their lifelong, and they were joined by some British poets. So the Images are in fact a group of poets made or that recorded the arts inputs of American poets like Ezra Pound, Hilda Doolittle, Carlos Williams, but also British writers like F.S. Flint, who else? Richard Aldington, D.H. Lawrence, and to some degree James Joyce. So let me take you to that period around 1910, 1914. The time was right for the creation of a movement along the lines of the discussions in the Poets Club that T.A. Hulme had created in 1907. They were greatly inspired by the triumph of the French symbolists, poets in French. and they solicited and won the sympathy of a group of poets, including, of course, Ezra Pound, who founded the movement, Ford Madox Ford, Hilda Doolittle. They all these poets started thinking about how to express poetic ideas by the rendering or the presentation of concrete objects. That was the premise from which they started, or on which they started. That is, how to dismiss a whole intellectual heritage that is made of conceptions, misconceptions, prejudices, and how to have a fresh look on poetry and a fresh look on things, on experience, and how to express this fresh look by the presentation of concrete objects. In 1913, the first statements about a theory of imagism came. Ezra Pound, in an essay, short essay he called A Few Don'ts by an Imagist, defines the image as, quote unquote, that which presents an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. F.S. Flint had a note on imagism that includes 3 rules or 3 do's by the images. First, direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective, whether it is a fish or a wheelbarrow or a state of feeling like love or hate or whatever. We will see how in Helen, Hilda Doolittle, in fact, builds up a whole poem on this particular feeling, that of hatred. That was the first rule. The second rule was how to use no word which does not contribute to presentation. And in fact, in doing this, the Imagists contributed considerably to ridding the English poetic language from redundancy, from verbiage, this verbosity. Third and last, in F.S. Flint's notes, was the recommendation with regard to rhythm, to compose in a sequence of the musical phrase, not in the sequence of the metronome. That was very important. In other words, Flint recommended that Imagist poetry be written in a totally new vision of the rhythm. So rhythm is not created in a sequence of the metronome, metronome, that is in stanza, in terms of stanza patterns, of rhyming scheme, of particular use of meter, regularity of cadence. No. Poetry should be now written or composed in sequence of the musical phrase. So the music or the cadence should exist now regardless of rhyme, totally regardless of rhyme, and it is it lies somewhere between the precise choice of words, the split of a phrase into fragments, whatever repetition, whatever emphasis is made until the end of the poem. So we should look for the music there and not in the regularity of rhythm. The second point that I wanted to point to is how the images, use of imagery, differed considerably from that of the symbolists. In fact, the Imagists were greatly inspired by the French symbolists, yet the use of imagery considerably varied from that of the French symbolists. I think that I will not be able to explain this better than it is done in the following passage. The symbolists dealt I think it's Ezra Pound himself who articulates this difference in the following passage. Is the difference between imagism and symbolism in the use of imagery. The symbolists dealt in association, that is, in a sort of allusion, almost of allegory. They degraded the symbol to the status of a word. They made it a form of metronomy. One can be grossly symbolic, for example, by using the term cross to mean trial. The symbolists' symbols have a fixed value like numbers in arithmetic, like 1, 2, and 7. The images have a variable significance, like the signs A, B, and X in algebra. The author must use his image because he sees it or feels it, not because he thinks he can use it to back up some creed or some system of ethics or economics. What Pound is saying here is, in fact, that while the symbolists dealt with images or with symbols in terms of a knowledge of conceptual knowledge of their meaning, the Imagists preferred a fresh perception of symbols. That is, the symbol and its meaning are born within the poem, not outside of the poem. They bear no affinity and no resemblance and no relation to knowledge, systems of ethics, of economics, or whatever outside of the poem. Among the following poets of the Imagist movement was Amy Lowell, who herself came from the United States, and she contributed to the three main anthologies that were published between 1915 and 1917. The first anthology of Imagist poets, Some Imagist Poets were its title, was published in 1915, and then followed two other anthologies in 1916 and 1917. Now, what the Imagist poets in these anthologies had in common were some common features that we associate with Imagist poets right from the start. The first one was in fact the verse form that their poetry was cast in. They all composed their poetry in free verse or in vers libre. That was a common feature. The second feature was an evasion, an escape from hard knowledge. And this dismissal of hard knowledge, of in fact abstract knowledge, looked to some critics as some sort of flabbiness, of lack of depth in this poetry, so that the first years of Imagism were not, in fact, very welcome. They were not welcomed by critical reception. They were dismissed as cheap poetry, as bad poetry, as poetry that can be coined by anyone, composed by anyone, and the critics looked upon Imagist poetry as, quote unquote, almost any kind of unrhymed, irregular verse with an image that meant some sort of pictorial impression. So that, and I think that this judgment on a critical judgment on the flabbiness of Imagist poetry was a misjudgment, because it needed some more time, and it needed that the Imagist had an impact on 20th century modern poetry. So it needed that, so that the critics, in fact, valorized the input of these Imagist poets. The short history of the movement was also marked by T.S. Eliot's arrival in England in 1914. His, of course, and we saw that in Morning at the Window. T.S. Eliot took naturally to some of the Imagist theories, and he developed them on his own terms in his own poems. And we can notice that in poems like Morning at the Window, which we read this semester, also in Preludes, and in the love song of G. Alfred Prufrock. All these poems were Imagists. Now, T.S. Eliot had two main contributions to the body of poetry called Imagist. He contributed with his theory of impersonality. This is how emotion in art is impersonal. That, of course, fit in beautifully with the Imagists' belief that poetry should be objective and concrete and totally rid of sentiment, of feeling. Okay, and his second contribution was with his theory of the objective correlative. That is how an object can itself help to in fact to function as a vehicle, as a means to translate a certain emotion. Good. I would also like to point to an aspect that characterized Imagist poetry. That is their attitude towards romanticism and towards classicism. In their preference, and I think that one cannot understand the Imagist short-lived but very powerful legacy if one does not relate their preference for dry hardness or dry objectivity as classically minded, classically oriented. That is, they preferred to look back on and to really emulate the classicists and bypass totally and disregard the romantic legacies. So, T.A. himself announced, with regard to Imagism, quote unquote, a period of dry, hard, classical verse is coming, meaning that we are in a new era in poetry now, and this poetry bears some affinity to the classicists in their choice of the right word, their use of the right equilibrium in dosing the language with the right rhythm, with the right music, and so on. So that was important. In pointing to Imagist poetry as dry, hard, classical verse, Hume's aim then, or objective then, was to revitalize the language, the English language, to get it away from the infinite vagueness of romantic sentimentalism by means of precise definition, and also to center on intuition and not on the intellect. This point about centering or focusing on or trusting intuition rather than the intellect was a means for the Imagist to, in fact, create a perception of experience that is totally immune, totally rid of all of all knowledge that existed on language or in language, and to choose a word or a sentence outside of language or outside of formulated known language. This point was very original. This move was very original, and it in fact marks most of 20th century art and literature. The modernists, the postmoderns, later in the 20th century, all made efforts to choose ways to choose a sentence outside of the sentence, or to choose a speech outside of formulated language. In fact, a number of postmodern critics and scholars theorize on this new, fresh look at language, at a language outside of language, or a sentence outside of the sentence. Some of them were, Homi Bhabha himself. Who else I'm thinking of? Anyway, the Imagist, in other words, took a fresh look to experience. This fresh, spontaneous, but thoughtful and classically oriented look needed certain moves. And the basic moves were, first, that there should be no fixed meter or rhyme, but a rhythm that is organic to the image itself. And we are going to see this in the selection of poems we have. Secondly, that there should be no narrative, no storytelling, no verbiage, no vagueness that would interfere with this fresh birth of the poem image. Thirdly, in spite of the concrete objectivity that these poets choose, yet there should be, according to them, a strong sense of the abstract, that was to be caught within the concrete. That is, they should, they each of them looked in their poetry at the precise point where there is a certain intuition to be seized, not knowledge but intuition, so that the knowledge that they create in their poetry, the experience that they create, is fresh, is new, is undiluted by prior knowledge. Fourth and last, the poem and not the word was the smallest unit of meaning. With Romantic poetry, with Victorian poetry, we had the line, we had the stanza as units of meaning. For the Imagists, well, the poem itself became the smallest unit of meaning. Not any particular word, line, or image. Um, so that the image itself becomes the speech. The word chosen was beyond or outside formulated language or common words. And I think we have an interesting example of this right choice of words in Oriad by Hilda Doolittle. But just before we get to the poems themselves, I just would like to end with a final characteristic or another characteristic of Imagism. I think I already pointed to it, but there's no harm in repeating it. Imagism contributed to modern poetry in that it cut out all redundancy or verbiage from the field of poetry. Ezra penned again, defining the test of the artist, I'm quoting here, the test of the artist is to be able to revise without showing a seam of revision, that is. And this was, according to him, no more than knowing what to cut, that is, what to delete. For instance, and he, in another situation, pointed to a poem that took about 80 words and how this poem should be cut down to about 45 words, something like that. So saying the minimum, but saying it rightly with precision and soundly. The last idea that I wanted to evoke in this introduction and on the main characteristics of Imagism, and which I did a bit awkwardly, I suppose, was about a word beyond formulated language. And I is replaced word by sentence, and I think that in this theory of language, which is very postmodern, word or sentence or discourse are interchangeable. You may take one for the other, depending on context, on your intention. Well, in fact, I wanted to mention Roland Barthes, the French postmodern critic, and his notion of a language outside of the sentence, as he articulates it in one of his books called Le plaisir du texte. What he meant, really, to simplify things to a maximum, what he meant is that is related to his actual experience in Tangier, in Morocco. He was sitting somewhere, not thinking of anything, and when he heard the multiplicity of languages and music and the sounds of transports and so on, the diffusion made for him. He does not understand the Arabic, of course, but diffusion made for him that is a language beyond formulated language. And what he meant is that, yes, language does not conform to a particular theory. Language sometimes is the sum of sounds and musics that we are not supposed to understand, to rationalize, to formulate in the form of theories so that we can understand it. And I mentioned Homi Bhabha because he starts one of his articles in one of the essays of the location of culture. I think it's the essay entitled "How Newness Comes to the World: The Trials of Cultural Representation, the Trials of Cultural Translation." Once again, how newness comes to the world: the trials of cultural translation. And in this essay, in this chapter of his book, of his groundbreaking book, The Location of Culture, Homi Bhabha, in fact, turns back to to this notion by Roland Barthes, and he theorizes on it in order to create his own idea of liminal spaces, or the spaces of liminality, as a new time and a new space in language and thought to formulate experiences that are not necessarily modern, that are not necessarily European, that are not necessarily Anglo-European, but that belong to other cultures. So that and that's what, by the way, that's what the location of culture is really about. It is a sum of chapters that make this groundbreaking move in post-colonial studies and post-colonial theory to create new spaces and new times for in language, for other thoughts, experiences to be. Okay, so that was my last point, and I come back to it now so that I make it understandable. And we move right away to the poems, and we start with Ezra Pound. Let me read one of his poems, one of the two short poems we have, and I start with "And the days. And the days are not full enough, and the nights are not full enough, and life slips by like a field mouse, not shaking the grass." Beautiful. Once again, and the days are not full enough, and the nights are not full enough, and life slips by like a field mouse, not shaking the grass. Well, if I were in front of you in a classroom, I would ask you, what do you think this poem is about? And you would raise your hand and you say, it's probably about time and the passage of time and how quick it is. And you would be perfectly right. And what we call that in another jargon is the carpe diem theme. The carpe diem theme. That is, that we are all doomed to die, it has been in European culture and literature. It has been given this label in Latin, carpe diem. Look it up in Google. So here the carpe diem theme is obvious. What is not obvious is Ezra Pound's original and very singular use of it. Well, what attracted my attention really is the way Ezra Pound founded himself, really, or helped found the Imagist circle, and he was, along with T.S. Eliot, among the first advocates of vers libre, and we read vers libre, if you remember, and still he had a very tempered use of vers libre. And if you have tempered, that is very reasonable, very his use was not very enthusiastic. I mean, he didn't think that vers libre is really the verse form to use in all contexts. And I remember one of his ideas in the short essay we read called Vers libre, and it's a retaliation on T.S. Eliot's reflections on vers libre. He said, well, he thinks that vers libre is that we should use vers libre only in contexts that call for such a use. But that's suppose that we have enough material, enough substance to write a sonnet, then we should write a sonnet and not a vers libre. Except that right now in contemporary life, it would be very difficult for poets to find the right substance and the right art material to write a sonnet. Why? Probably because the sonnet translated and was the appropriate verse form for the Renaissance sensibility, and that in the 20th century there is a totally different sensibility, so that the vers libre is perhaps the most appropriate verse form to fit in with this that fits in coherently with the modern sensibility. So his use of vers libre is very, very tempered, and I think that we can let me just read on. Yeah. Another point that I would like to make about this poem is that while Carlos Williams and Hilda Doolittle Imagist verse approximates the condition of plastic art, as we are going to see in a while, and what we talked about plastic art, we talked about post-impressionism and impressionism in the arts, the French post-impressionists as having contributed to the idea of modernity in the arts, in literature and the arts. So while with Williams and Haydée, Imagist poetry approximates the condition of plastic arts, in Pound it approximates the condition of music. This is very peculiar and very original in Pound, and I think that one of the essays that T.S. Eliot wrote is about poetry and music, and he makes reference to Ezra Pound. How could poetry approximate the condition of music? Well, poetry is at the same time abstract, but it's not destitute of meaning. And it translates an emotion. It relies heavily on words and their musicality. And Ezra Pound thought, in fact, and I'm quoting him, that words are the hardest of all material of art to find. They are the hardest because the poet should pick up words that have a certain musicality in when you create a sequence of them. And I think that we said, if you remember, about the when we were defining the main characteristics of Imagism, that as regards rhythm, Imagists, in fact, composed in sequence of musical phrases, not in sequence of the metronome. And they created a cadence that was unrhymed, but it was there. So I think that's all. Going back on and the days, once again, doesn't it strike you that the poem starts in a middle? I mean, and the days. It's as if the speaker were talking about the days, and then, or about something and the days. The poem starts in a middle, and it's moving. So we should not be concerned about how it begins, because it begins anyway, and we are in that instance of time where life is underway. I mean, we are creatures of time, and time, in fact, as it creates us, develops us, and the use of and creates the linearity, the movement onwards, the linearity that the modernists, in one way or another, found very dangerous and wanted to stop, because linearity meant the running of time, and it meant death at the same time. Well, I think it's very interesting that this poem should start in a middle. That we are not, or it's no need, or it's useless to be concerned with a start. We are at this instant of time in the middle. What is the focus in the poem is almost totally on this movement to an end, and it is the movement to an end which is really striking. The end turns out to be the completed, the rounding up of one image, and that image is that time slips by in our life as discreetly, as slyly, sournois, as slyly as a field mouse moves in the crops, in the fields, ravaging, eating crops unnoticed. Nobody knows the ravages that mice create until they wake up in the morning, but the mouse does not create noise. So this is really a very beautiful image. What emotion is evoked? Imagist poetry creates that idea image or idea thing that results in a one emotion. So to this question, I think personally it's a sort of impassive surrender to fatal reality, to the fatal reality of death. And a paraphrase of this poem would be that a one temporary life is hardly sufficient. It's not full enough. That is, it's hardly sufficient for any one person. Neither, and it's a full day, night and day, they are not hardly sufficient for us to make all the things we want to make, to be as happy as we would like to, and so on. Time slips by as slyly as a field mouse, creating ravages in the crops. The crops, we can take the crops forbid the human body, and it creates these ravages unnoticed. Nobody pays attention. With regards to form, we notice in this poem an apparent reprise of the couplet, an apparent use of the couplet. But notice how disparate are the metrical feet. We have iambs in some lines, but we have dactyls in some other lines. So that even if Ezra Pound is writing to an iambic meter, he's also writing against it, creating disparity, creating disorder. As to the length of lines, we notice that there's a manipulation of this length. And you notice with me how the first three lines, and the days are not full enough, and the nights are not full enough, and life slips by like a field mouse. They create an illusionary regularity or linearity, that it will go on and on and on and on. But this regularity of rhythm, this linearity of time is just illusionary. And the last line stops bluntly and firmly this illusion. This creates a stop to this illusion. That's probably why it is shorter than the three above lines. I think there is manipulation, deliberate manipulation of the idea of the couplet, of the metrical feet, and of the length of lines, and it is very, very beautiful. Yes, and I had suddenly this idea of sharing with you a haiku that I wrote on the same theme, that is the Carpe Diem theme. So I'm going to let you read through it on your own, and you can ask me questions during our live Facebook session, if you like. But it's a haiku, it's not, it is images, or so I suppose you will answer me. So I've given you a series of questions on that, and I will wait for your feedback. And we move on to the second poem by Ezra Pound, In a Station of the Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. You probably can remember what Ezra Pound thought or how he defined the image. He said that the image is a complex of objects and emotion in an instant of time. And I think that this poem does exactly that. It's an image created by the look of a certain situation, people running to the metro station, caught in an instant of time. The look of these people as they are running to the metro station. But notice how the poem reads as a sudden revelation, as an apparition. The apparition, that is, it just showed up suddenly. But the sudden character, the abrupt character of that situation is not the people's, it is the poet's recognition of the likeness between two things. I mean, he suddenly realizes, or he suddenly recognizes a likeness and affinity between these two things. Is on the one hand, and the terms of the comparison, if you like, are on the one hand people running to the metro station, and on the other hand, petals on a black wet bough. Leaves on the bough of a tree in a winter day, and that bough is black because it's winter, but it's probably because it's dreary and gray and aging probably. Anyway, the poem reads as a sudden revelation or apparition. It's a recognition of likeness between two things. On the one hand, people at the metro are seen as petals, petals. And what leaps to our mind, petals are leaves. What leaps to our mind are certain titles like Petals of Blood by Ngugi wa Thiong'o or Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. But the petals here, I'm sure that Ezra Pound's petals have nothing to do with these petals or leaves that Ngugi wa Thiong'o or Whitman evoke. It's they are a contemporary urban. They are the translation of a contemporary urban scene, which is dreary, grey, and sad. So back to the terms of the comparison, we have people running to the station, and we have these petals on a black. Synonyms would be grey or dreary. Wet is probably winter time, so day in winter. Bough, and then bough is a tree bough, but while the tree is a symbol of life, the bough is maybe interpreted as a fragment of life. So I think that Ezra Pound's touch is in this fragmentation. So we notice fragmentation. We notice this fragmentation operating at the level of diction. So for instance, for faces is a deliberate synecdoche. It's a part of a whole. So people, as they are running to the metro, they are seen as faces. They are reduced to faces. We notice also the fragmentation operating in the second word in the poem, about. Let me remind you that Ezra Pound was most cautious, perhaps the most cautious of all Imagist poets about the choice of words, and he said somewhere that words are the hardest material to find, the hardest material of art to find ever. Okay. We notice also at the level of grammar, we notice the dominance of a broken syntax. And notice how the statements are all noun phrases. There are no verb phrases. There is no movement. There's just, a camera shots for these things. The faces, the petals, the bow. The faces, the metro station, the petals, the bow. It's so there's a broken syntax, and as we said before, there may be no need of it, really, because Ezra Pound's intention is to present, not to represent, present an image in an instant of time. The line length, notice how the second line is almost put on top of the first line or next to it. It's one way. The technique that Ezra Pound finds to put symbol on top of the object, and the symbol becomes the object. And one way of doing that is that the shortest you do it, the better. The shortest are the lines, the better. What emotion? How would you define the emotion that is evoked in this poem? Not very different from that suggested in And the Days. Impassive acceptance of a sad reality. It's an impassive acceptance of a sad reality. The speaker presents a common scene from contemporary urban life, and he presents it as a sad, futile show or spectacle. Why futile? Because the petals are doomed to fall off in winter, and so will these faces. So that's pretty final. And right away, I take you to Hilda Doolittle. Of course, we're not introducing these poets, and you may find their biographies and on the internet. That's your part of the job. We are here concentrating on the poems. And we start with Ariad. If ever you looked up these words or misspelled it and looked it up on the internet, you would know that the title is a reference to a Greek mythical mountain nymph. And the nymphs are mythological spirits of nature. They're just des esprits, spirits of nature. And they are imagined in European culture or mythological culture. They are imagined as a beautiful maiden inhabiting rivers or woods, forests, or mountains. Ariad is a mountain nymph, for instance. They're not dangerous, but they can be very vengeful and nasty when they are aggressed or intruded upon. And all of us remember the story of Actaeon, who surprised Artemis and her maiden nymphs. Artemis is the goddess of hunting, and she was bathing naked with her maiden nymphs in a river, and Actaeon surprised them, and he kept looking at them, and she turned him into a stag. So I don't wish that either for you or for myself. Okay, so much for the Ariad as and what she is. Notice with me. Let me read the poem. Whirl up, sea, whirl your pointed pines, Splash your great pines on our rocks. Hurl your green over us. Cover us with your pools of fur. Once again. Whirl up sea, whirl your pointed pines. Splash your great pines on our rocks. Hurl your green over us. Cover us with your pools of fur. Yes. First, the sea is seen in terms of woods. Woods, a forest with high pine trees. Probably in reference to the enormity of the waves. So it's Oread calling for a storm, isn't it? It's Oread, the mountain nymph, calling for a storm, calling the sea for a sea storm. And the occasion is not specified. What is the reason this nymph is calling for a sea storm? This remains obscure in the poem. Is it to punish others? Maybe a careless lover's woman? Maybe to cleanse the land? Or maybe to show off her power as a nymph to instigate force? Well, this is not specified in the poem. However, the color symbolism, green and white, connotates, in fact, has positive connotations. It connotates fertility, for instance. Fertility, that is, the water element is a sign of life, and when covering the land is as a fusion that can only produce fruit and is fertile. But it can also refer to an overwhelming emotion. Pool at in the last line also connotes a comfortable water place, doesn't it? A pool, a pool. You're comfortable in a pool. And when Heidi says, cover us with your pools of fur, she's referring to the splashing waves and how they cover the land with their pools of fur. It's like a woman wearing fur. Fur, it's fur. So the color symbolism is really positive in connotation. There's no harm meant by this mountain nymph through the sea storm. Let me read it again. Whirl up sea, whirl your pointed pines, splash your great pines on our rocks. Hurl your green over us, cover us with your pools of fur. This is an Imagist poem par excellence, and I think that ever since the beginning, critics quoted it as the Imagist poem, and they set it up as the best example of an Imagist poem. Why? Well, it presents the idea of a sea storm as it happens, almost visually, almost in live action, doesn't it? So the reader is led to experience the poem from within. There's no appeal. No appeal is made, that is, with regard to symbolism or abstractions, to external knowledge. The poem creates its own experience of a sea storm, and we see this experience from within. We follow it almost step by step, or in movement. We follow it in movement. So that's how the thing or the object becomes the emotion. With regard to form, the poem is one sentence long, and it is in 26 words. Very short, in fact. The lines vary in length, and they vary in length almost, the variance is almost between splashing short waves and thudding long waves. So we see movements of the waves. Sometimes they are short, sometimes they are long and more forceful and great and pointed, like the pines. And what comes to my mind again now is a very poetic or a poetic in prose novel, short novel by Virginia Woolf, a modernist. The novel is called The Waves, but the idea is totally different in The Waves, of course. Is how the succession of individual waves makes up immortality, or creates a way to resist to mortality. One individual life is doomed to die, but its succession, that is togetherness, to be together, like waves successing one another, is one way to resist mortality. A beautiful image again. You notice with me how women images or modernist writers are drawn to the water element. They are drawn. It's a whole theory, in postmodern theory. There's a whole theory why women are drawn to the water element, and what the water element, the sea, the shore, the waves, the pools and the rivers, why are they attracted? And I think that French critique, and I'm going to refer to Hélène Cixous, I think, and Hélène Cixous and Lucy Irigaray, two French postmodern critics who theorize on this idea, and they made very interesting findings for those of you who are interested. And the last point that I want to point to with regard to Ariad is the speaker is how the speaker is using a precision and a simplicity. The poem is simple and precise to the maximum, but how this precision and simplicity are deliberate, because they help the poem to build in volume, like waves building in force, okay? And to really pack an immediate pull at the reader. What I mean here is that little by little and movement by movement is almost like a painter using his brush, and each time adding a certain touch to the object of his presentation. And when he finishes, the image idea grows total in front, that is in our eyes, and that is why, in fact, station Ariad. Yes. Good. Helen, the next poem. I feel that I'm running fast, but I think that if you have questions, we can stop at them afterwards. So we really need to round up this course. Helen is the second and final poem by Heidi, and I'll call her Heidi. All Greece hates the still eyes and the white face, the luster as of olives where she stands, and the white hands. All Greece reviles the one face when she smiles, hating it deeper still when it grows wan and white, remembering past enchantments and past ills. Greece sees unmoved, God's daughter, born of love, the beauty of cool feet and slanderous knees, the beauty of cool feet and slanderous knees. Greece sees and moved, God's daughter, born of love, the beauty of cool feet and slenderest knees. Could love indeed the maid, that is, Greece could love indeed. Greece sees and Greece could love indeed the maid, only if she were led white ash amid funeral cypresses. Let me try again, perhaps this time better, I hope. All Greece hates the still eyes in the white face, the luster as of olives where she stands and the white hands. All Greece reviles the one face when she smiles, hating it deeper still when it grows wan and white, remembering past enchantments and past ills. Greece sees and moved, God's daughter, born of love, the beauty of cool feet and slenderest knees, could love indeed the maid, only if she were led white ash amid funeral cypresses. Right. Well, notice with me how there is a word in this poem with synonyms of it. So we have hate in the first stanza, we have reviles in the second stanza, we have love, we have unmoved in the third stanza, unmoved, love, but could love only if, conditional love. So what we have is a set of very negative images with regard to a woman, and how Greece nurtures very strong and very negative emotions towards this woman. So the first question that comes to mind is, who is Helen and why Greece hates her to the point of wanting her dead? Because the last stanza is a death wish. Helen is Helen of Troy, Hélène de Troie, and the poem is a portrait of the Spartan woman Helen. She is from Sparta. We are here in ancient Greece, the Greek Empire, the Greek civilization. So Helen of Troy, Helen is essentially Spartan, and she is married to the king of one of the cities of Greece, and she is esteemed to be the most beautiful woman in Greece. But here in the poem, she is the most hated woman by all of Greece, and all of Greece, the Trojans are part of that Greek Empire. They're part of it. And why do they hate her? What did she do? She escaped with Paris, one of the princes of Troy. She escaped with him to Troy in a moment of inattention. I think they were holding a ceremony, and the Trojans were also invited to the ceremony on the Greek, on other lands of Greece, of ancient Greece, and she escaped with him. Did they fall in love? Did he force her? Did she escape of her own will? History is very controversial. We are not going to stop at this. We will suppose that she escaped with him willingly, which is, according to me, the most plausible theory. Anyway, Troy was then a very prosperous Bronze Age city of Turkey, of the Turkish Empire. It's now called Turkey. It's the current Turkey, and when she fled from another city to Troy, her escape caused or started a 10-year war between the Greeks, where she had her family, her husband, I think Menelaus, and between them and the Trojans, who became very reticent hosts. That is, yes, she was beautiful, but they were afraid of being attacked by the Greeks because, after all, she is married and her husband can come after her. And it was then a point of honor to take revenge from those who attacked one's honor. At the end of this 10-decade war, the Trojans lost the war. Only Aeneas, a Trojan, and very few others fled the massacre and became the progenitors of the Romans. And this is what Virgil's Aeneid is about, by the way. We have the Odyssey and we have the Aeneid, and the Aeneid is about the beginning of the Roman Empire, just as the Odyssey is a celebration of the growth of the Greek Empire. So that's the story behind Ellen. And Heidi was apparently very fascinated by this figure, and she wrote more than one poem about her. I think that there is a much longer poem on Helen of Troy. But anyway, we keep with this poem. Let me read it again. All Greece hates the still eyes in the white face, the luster as of olives where she stands, and the white hands. All Greece reviles the one face when she smiles, hating it deeper still when it grows wan and white, remembering past enchantments and past ills. The Greek sees unmoved God's daughter, born of love. The beauty of cool feet and slenderest knees could love indeed the maid. Greece could love indeed the maid, only if she were led white ash amid funeral cypresses, only if she was led in a tomb, dead with the ashes of funeral cypresses. Good. So the poem reads, the words are very simple. We have a one word with different variations of it, or different shades of meaning. Hates deeply, reviles, sees unmoved, love, wish dead, which is a paraphrase of they could love her only if she were led in a tomb with the other dead. Anyway, now what makes this poem very intense in emotion is that this one emotion is built in degrees, in different degrees, in 3 different degrees, and that other aspects of language are put in the service of this passion, of the building up of this tension of a passion into it is from simple hate to deep hate to death wishing. Okay, that is what makes of this poem really well, not powerful, but very intense. The emotion of the poem being a hate building to the degree of death wish. Notice with me how the 3 paragraphs builds gradually attention, both in terms of color and in terms of words. And this tension is maintained until it explodes at last into wishing Helen dead. Notice also how the number of lines per stanza reinforces this movement in crescendo, this intensification of negative passion, of hate. And we notice that that the first stanza is in 5 lines, the second stanza in 6 lines, and the third stanza in 7 lines. So the number of lines reinforces this idea of an emotion building up to a maximum, and the maximum is the death wishing, of course. It's a beautiful poem, isn't it? Okay, and for the sake of exercise, I made a little search, and then I picked up for you a painting by Paul Cézanne, and another one by Henri Matisse. But just before we move to these 2 poems, one of them at least is an exercise for you to do. I finished my notes on my analysis of Henriette. Yes, yeah. So Henriette is a very good example of what Carlos Williams Carlos said about no image but in think, no image but no idea, but no ideas but in things. The idea or the notion of the emotion of passion, of the passion of hate, is here built in the sea and in the movement of the wives and in the look of the wives. Notice with me also the different shades of white and green. And this is really why I thought of this painting by Henri Matisse. And I want to draw your attention to Hades, to Hilda Doolittle's use of shades of green and shades of white. And so that you see what I mean, I shared this painting by Matisse. Notice Hades' use of shades of green. We have olive green, we have cypress green, and of white. We have one white, we have white, and we have ashy white. You can look up these shades of white and green, but what interests me now is that they are very reminiscent of a plastic art use of them, which is very impressionist or impressionistic. So if you have a look at this painting with me, we have different shades of green, don't we? We have a green that is olive green. We have a cypress green, both on the boughs of the tree and on the clouds on top of the tree. And in the movement of the boughs, we have the idea of a windy day. Okay, so that the movement is towards either a sea or a void. Notice how the tree happens to be on the side of an alley, and it's a mountain alley. That is, the tree has a very singular a very singular placement. In fact, in this context, that's perhaps why its leaves and its the whole of the tree is shaped by the wind. Okay, is that an indication to the fragility of this tree? Because it happens to be on top of a mountain and at one side of an alley, or is it? But the shades of green connote cypress green is an indication of death. of an ashy brown dark color. Okay, so it's not an indication of life. See, so this is how we can learn, all of us, to read color symbolism, both in poetry and in the plastic arts. So my questions, I have two questions here for you to think further. What shades of green is there, or what shades of green are there in Matisse Entitled? And how interpret Hades' shades of green? Well, green is normally, that is conceptually, that's what formulated knowledge and formulated language has as wants us to understand. Green is the color of hate. White is the color of innocence. And gray and cypress green, brown cypress green is a symbol of decay and of death. The question is Hilda Doolittle sticking to this concept, or is she doing the opposite, or is she turning these concepts upside down? Okay, that's for you to think about. I take you also to another painting by Paul Cézanne, another post-impressionist, and I thought of this portrait of a woman in relation to Helen. So Helen is painted with words and is surrounded with hate and a reviling attitude on the part of all of Greece. What is this woman sitting on a desk and probably holding something like a book? What emotion or what state of mind is Paul Cézanne trying to evoke about this woman through his choice of color and shades of color? That's a question for you to answer. And we come, guys, to the last of this course and to the last poem that we shall read together. And it's no other than a poem that I already mentioned in class and quoted and analyzed at various points. And here I'm going to go over it for a last time. So it's The Red Wheelbarrow by Carlos Williams. Make sure you get the name right, because sometimes we tend to say Carlos Williams. It's Carlos Williams. Okay. And I read this very short poem. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow beside the white chicken. This is extraordinary, and there's a great deal of criticism. There's a great deal of literature written on this poem, so I'm not going to evoke to mention all of it, or to I'm going to stick to a minimum, because poetry and literature, generally speaking, is amenable to different types of interpretation. What matters for me is understanding, and the process of understanding a poem doesn't have a one way. It's the ways to understanding are manifold, they are multiple. And you're not supposed to understand a poem or a novel by encompassing all of the knowledges and all of what has been written about it. No. At the end of the day, what counts, what matters is to choose what you as a person, as a reader, as a critic are comfortable with, what kind of interpretation. And then you stay faithful to that interpretation. Be conscious all the time that there are other interpretations, and that if ever you were asked about other interpretations, you may perhaps mention some, but you could always say, in my opinion, this is the meaning of this poem. And nobody can tell you you're wrong as long as you defend yourself with the right evidence. And as long as you are coherent, because art is amenable to different interpretations for the simple reason that it's a human science. It's not scientific. It's not measured by equations or anything. It's a question of understanding. As long as you understand, that's fine, and it's fine for me too. So keep that in mind. Okay, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow beside the white chicken. Yeah, probably one of the most famous poems of 20th century American poetry. No doubt about that. And this is what a number of critics agree upon. What I can tell you is that it is Imagist, 100%. It is simple, but it is deceptively simple. Why? Because it's rich and multiple in meanings, or in meaning. Now, are we concerned about this multiplicity of meaning, or do we mean to understand it? That is, to come up with an understanding of it. To me, it's the latter. It's not the former. So I'm not concerned with how many interpretations you may gather about this poem. I want just the interpretation you're comfortable with. And I'm at heart, I am an ecologist. I am a green intellectual. That is, I have a lot of interest in environmental humanities, and one of my doctoral students is working on eco-criticism and environmental philosophy in literature. So I'm going to, for this reason, and because this is the kind of person I am at heart, I'm going to stick to the easiest and the most ecological of all interpretations. I'm going to effect the next move, and every one of you should effect this move according to my own philosophy of life, or philosophy propensity, what I like best about how to see nature and how to see objects. That is the ecological dimension. But you may either agree with me, or you may choose your own interpretation. But to effect this mood, I think that you need, and this is very important for your analysis, you need first to guess at the persona. You need to define a persona behind the speaker. Who is it? Is it a farmer speaking? Is it the teacher speaking? Who is she? Well, she told us that she's an ecologist at heart, and that we don't care about that. We want, I think that I would like, some of you might say, to read, to read war and to read conflict into this poem, and to interpret symbolism in political or in using political philosophy rather than ecological philosophy, and so on. So it all depends on what you make of the persona. Once you guess at the persona, you raise questions about the basic situation and what it might mean. So you make the correlation between situation and speaker. And that's the only way for you to understand the meaning of the poem. Let's think about its paraphrasable meaning. This is what it can mean most basically. And we shall suppose the persona, to be a poultry farmer. You know poultry? Poultry is chicken. And most of the time it is white chicken. It's not Jajal Bildi, it's not Jajal Hamar, it is white chicken, white chicken. But this is farm white chicken. So it's for the Europeans, this is the best you can have of chicken. It is raised in a farm and not a factory. And certainly not the kind of chicken that McDonald's uses. So don't ever eat the chicken that McDonald's prepares, because it's very bad for your health. So supposing that the persona is a poultry farmer, he's sitting, probably sipping his coffee, or smoking his a cigar if he's no, not a cigar, certainly not. That's a bad idea. So a poultry farmer sitting in his backyard, facing his garden or whatever. It's early morning, and he says, and it was rainy at night. It's the morning after a rainy night, and you know that the morning after a rainy night, the sunshine, the light is just superb, and the sunshine makes everything dazzling, shiny. When, for instance, on the trees, it makes leaves shine. On the color, it sort of makes that color show forth more, and so on. So it's a poultry farmer early morning after a rainy night. The farmer suddenly notices the wheelbarrow and how the equilibrium of his life and of his trade, if any, he might be selling chicken to markets. So he suddenly notices the wheelbarrow, and he makes this sudden recognition about the equilibrium of his, how the equilibrium of his life reposes heavily on these two objects, a wheelbarrow and a poultry chicken. That's the sum of what he is, that's the sum of his life. I mean, that's his happiness. His happiness reposes, the balance in his life reposes on that. That could be a paraphrasable meaning, that is a celebration of farming life as the best, because it keeps you close to nature, because you don't lose contact with what you are. It keeps you, it maintains to you all your humanity, and you're not lured by globalization, by fake progress, by industry. I mean, it's rural idyllic life, and this is and the wheelbarrow and the white chicken, the red and the white, are supposed to create the two extremes of the balance of the good equilibrium. Well, but of course, this is an easy and accessible paraphrasable meaning, but you can come up, as I said before, in class with plenty of interpretations. Now, what really matters to me again is the idea that the fact that this poem targets one of the meanings targeted by this poem is changing our idea of what poetry is and what it should be about. For Carlos Williams, what he's saying is that, well, we can write a poem on a wheelbarrow and a white chicken, and it can still be the best poem of the 20th century. I mean, I'm a bit kidding, but this is, so the idea that poetry should be about these two objects changes totally our idea of what poetry is or should be about. Besides its simple meaning, the poem can have many interpretations depending, and I repeat it again, depending on how we react to its color symbolism, the red and white, and our guess at the persona behind the speaker. Who is he? So that sums up the thing. And the last point I'm going to make regards the form. Notice, and the form is very Imagist again. Notice the broken syntax. We see the broken syntax even better in this poem. We have a 6-line sentence, and it's just a one sentence. And it's written like, the way the Chinese, the Mandarin Chinese is written. They don't write horizontally, they write vertically. It's a bit with the ideogram and whatever accompanies it. It's a bit like that, but it's not. Again, Carlos Williams is not under this influence. He just breaks his syntax. Notice, for instance, how wheel and barrow are broken into two parts, and how white and chicken are broken. Normally, in prose you won't break them. Well, but breaking them is William's imagistic. Notice how imagist is relating to imagistic is having the quality of being. Note that again. Imagistic is a qualifying adjective. Imagistic means it has this quality of being imagist. When you say images, that means, well, it's part of imagism. Okay. For me, to separate the wheel and barrow and white and chicken into separate fragments is William's imagistic technique of leading us gradually into the concept image. The concept image is built degree by degree, fragment by fragment, and it's drawing attention to the objects, to the things themselves. He says himself, no ideas but in things. And this is an excellent way to sum up this fusion between emotion and objects. This objective correlative, in fact, that T.S. Eliot, in a different way, articulates somewhere else. And this, guys, brings us to the end of this seminar, to the end of this course. It has been a pleasure. Well, not always, because I had to really prepare the course and to make the research as I am teaching it for a first time. But I like poetry, and I'm a practicing poet now and then. So I learned a great deal from this course, and I hope that I have enjoyed it to a maximum, and I hope, and I try to share as much of my pleasure, as much of my discoveries with you as possible. I have been told, no, why do you go to these lands? They won't understand. But I think that, no, it is possible when you share knowledge. Your interlocutors are happy to share it with you. And if you share with me as much as I have shared with you, I'm sure that you will make a fine thing of this course. Thank you very much. And I will see you next time in our live session. Bye-bye.